The sun was beginning to dip behind the mountains, casting a golden glow across the dry, dusty plains. The air was cool, but the weight of the long day still clung to the land like a heavy blanket. In the middle of this solitude stood a small, weather-beaten barn, the only sign of life for miles. It was a humble place, a home to Jack Turner, a lone cowboy who had chosen to live far from the bustle of town life. Jack was no stranger to solitude. The ranch had been his refuge for years now, ever since he'd left the noise and heartbreak of a crowded world behind. His family was long gone, and the friends he once had scattered to the winds. He didn't mind the isolation. It gave him a sense of peace, a way to forget the pain of the past and simply live day by day. The ranch kept him busy enough with its daily chores, tending to the cattle, fixing fences, and making sure his small vegetable garden survived the harsh conditions. But today, there was a change in the air. As Jack finished up his work stacking hay in the barn, he felt it. A slight shift in the wind, a stirring in the dust. Something wasn't right. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a quiet unease settled deep in his chest. It wasn't the first time he had felt like this, though. There was a sharpness to the stillness that set his senses on edge, making his hand instinctively reach for the rifle leaning against the barn door. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand, squinting into the setting sun. Just as he turned to walk back to the house, a faint sound caught his attention. A soft rustling followed by a weak moan. Jack froze. The sound wasn't natural. It was too slow, too labored. His eyes darted over the land, searching for the source. But he saw nothing but the empty horizon. Then he saw her. A small figure was staggering toward the barn, weaving in and out of the shadows as she slowly made her way across the open field. At first, Jack thought she might be another rancher. Perhaps someone from a neighboring farm who had gotten lost in the heat. But as she drew closer, he saw the details. The torn clothing, the wild, unkempt hair, and most noticeably her limp. She wasn't walking. She was barely holding herself up, each step a struggle. Without thinking, Jack rushed toward her, his boots kicking up the dust as he moved. His heart raced with a mix of confusion and concern. Who was she? What had happened to her? When he reached her, she collapsed into his arms. Her skin was burning with fever, and her face was pale with exhaustion. She had barely the strength to speak, her words coming in broken whispers. "Help. Please," she managed, her voice raspy and weak. They're coming." Jack didn't understand, but he didn't need to. Instinctively, he scooped her up in his arms and carried her inside the barn, laying her down on the hay with care. He grabbed a blanket from the corner and covered her, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. The woman's breathing was shallow, and her eyes fluttered in and out of consciousness. Jack's mind raced. Who could have done this to her? And why was she so far from anyone else? He didn't know the answers, but the urgency in her voice was enough to make him act. With steady hands, Jack examined her wounds. She had a deep gash on her leg, likely from a sharp object. There were bruises on her arms and a scrape on her face, but nothing seemed life-threatening. Still, the fever was a bad sign. She had to be treated, and soon, or she might not survive. As he worked to clean her wounds, the woman began to stir again. Her eyes opened, though they seemed clouded with pain and confusion. "Where am I?" she asked weakly, her voice barely audible. "You're safe," Jack replied, his tone calm but firm. "You're at my place. You're gonna be okay." The woman's eyes searched his face, as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. She didn't seem to recognize him, but Jack didn't mind. The important thing was that she was here now, and he wasn't about to let her suffer alone in the wilderness. "My name's Asha," she said after a long pause, her voice thick with exhaustion. I was with my people, but we were attacked. I couldn't save them." Her voice trailed off and her eyes closed again, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Jack's heart went out to her. He didn't know the details of her story, but the sorrow in her eyes spoke volumes. Whoever had attacked her people had left her with nothing but pain and fear. "I'm Jack," he said quietly, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You don't need to worry about anything here. I'll keep you safe." Asha nodded weakly, the tension in her face easing slightly. She seemed to trust him even though they were strangers. Jack didn't know if it was just the exhaustion or something deeper, but he couldn't help feeling a connection. Maybe it was the way she looked at him, or maybe it was the way her story mirrored his own, of loss, survival, and the search for peace. He stayed by her side through the night, watching over her as she slept fitfully, Her fever didn't break, and the hours stretched on with no sign of her improving. Jack kept his vigil, his thoughts racing. He had lived alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to care for someone else. But now, with Asha's life in his hands, that old sense of responsibility came rushing back. By morning, Asha's condition had worsened. Her fever was high and she seemed barely conscious. Jack knew he had to do something, but he wasn't sure what. His knowledge of medicine was limited, and the nearest doctor was days away. But he couldn't let her die here, not in his barn, not on his watch. He decided to take her to the creek for fresh water, hoping the coolness would help bring down her fever. Gently, he lifted her into his arms again, careful not to hurt her, and made his way outside. The sky had turned a soft pink and the land was bathed in the first light of day. It was a beautiful, peaceful morning, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. As he walked toward the creek, he glanced over his shoulder, his instincts telling him to be alert. He couldn't explain why, but he felt the weight of the land pressing down on him as if it was trying to tell him something. Something wasn't right. Jack's eyes narrowed as he scanned the horizon. He couldn't see anything yet, but he felt it, a growing tension, an unspoken warning. Asha stirred in his arms, and he looked down at her, determined to get her the help she needed. But little did he know, a storm was coming. And it wasn't just the weather that would bring danger to his doorstep. The sun had barely risen, and the early morning air was cool, carrying the scent of wildflowers and fresh dew. Jack stood beside the creek, the water flowing lazily over smooth rocks as he gently dipped a cloth into the cool stream. He looked down at Asha, still unconscious in his arms. Her fever had broken, but she remained pale and weak, her breathing slow and shallow. Jack wasn't a doctor, but he knew enough to keep her hydrated and rested. He had to get her well, and quickly. As he pressed the damp cloth to her forehead, his thoughts turned to the strange feeling he had yesterday, the one that made his heart race and his instincts scream that something was wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling that danger was close. The land around his ranch had always been quiet. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and most of the time the only visitors he got were the occasional travelers or cattle rustlers who passed through. But there was something different about this morning. A heavy silence hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. Jack tried to push away his unease, focusing on Asha's condition. He needed to get her back to the barn where he could keep her safe. He carefully lifted her up again, holding her close as he made his way back across the field. The barn, sitting just beyond a small hill, was visible in the distance, its wooden structure dark against the morning sky. But as Jack made his way back toward the barn, something caught his eye. A flicker of movement on the horizon. At first he thought it was just a trick of the light, perhaps a bird or a coyote darting through the brush, but then another shape appeared and another. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that it wasn't just one animal. These were people. Jack stopped in his tracks, his hand tightening around the rifle slung over his shoulder. He knew every inch of this land, and there were no groups of travelers that should be here, especially not so early in the morning. The figures were still far away, but they were coming closer, too many to be a simple accident. His mind raced, piecing together what little he knew. The figures were moving quickly, a group of riders on horseback. There were more than a dozen of them, their dark shapes growing larger by the second. Jack's gut clenched and a chill ran down his spine. He knew these men. They weren't just any riders. They were Apache warriors, the ones who had been searching for Asha, the same ones she had spoken of when she was half-conscious in his arms. Jack's first thought was to hide. He didn't want any trouble, especially not with a group of armed warriors who might mistake him for an enemy. But his second thought, the one that came from deep inside his chest, was to protect Asha. She couldn't run, and he wasn't about to let her fall into their hands. He glanced down at her, her pale face still pressed against his chest. She was completely unaware of the danger that was approaching. Jack's mind spun into overdrive. There was no time to waste. If he didn't act now, they would be here in minutes, and there would be no way to escape. Taking a deep breath, Jack turned sharply toward the barn, moving as fast as he could without jostling Asha too much. His boots hit the ground hard, and he felt the weight of the rifle against his back, its presence a reminder of what was at stake. As he neared the barn, Jack made a quick decision. He needed to get Asha inside, out of sight, and prepare for whatever was coming. He didn't know how many warriors were in the group, but he knew it wouldn't take much for them to overwhelm him if they decided to attack. He had to think fast, and he had to be smart. Jack pushed the barn door open, his eyes scanning the area. The barn was small and modest, but it was sturdy. It had a loft above for storing hay, and the lower level held various tools and supplies. Jack quickly set Asha down on a pile of hay near the back corner, making sure she was as comfortable as possible. He then moved to the far side of the barn, where he kept extra supplies, a few old barrels of nails, a coil of rope, and some other odds and ends. He could hear the sound of hooves now growing louder, closer. Jack's hands worked quickly as he took a long piece of rope and tied it to one of the support beams. He wasn't sure if it would work, but he was counting on his instincts. He had to make it seem like he was prepared for whatever was coming. He ran to the barn door and peeked out, just in time to see the riders approaching. There were more than just a dozen now, at least 30, maybe more. They were moving fast, their horses kicking up dust behind them as they rode across the open field toward his barn. Jack's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had to think. The riders weren't in a hurry, but they weren't wasting time either. They were circling the barn now, almost as if they were sizing it up, considering their options. Jack could hear their voices drifting on the wind, too far away to make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. They were angry, and they were looking for something or someone. Jack ducked back into the barn, his heart racing. Asha was still unconscious, oblivious to the danger outside. He had to keep her safe. He moved quickly, securing the door as best as he could, then stacking some heavy crates in front of the door to block it. It wouldn't hold up forever, but it might buy him enough time to figure out what to do next. The warriors continued their slow circle around the barn, but Jack knew it wouldn't be long before they realized he was inside. He had no idea if they were aware that Asha was here with him, but if they found out, it could make things much worse. He needed to stay hidden, to remain unnoticed for as long as possible. A strange calm settled over Jack. He wasn't sure where it came from, but he knew it was his only chance to get through this. He moved to the loft, climbing the wooden steps as quietly as he could, his eyes scanning the room for anything that could help. He found a few old rifles, a box of ammunition, and a couple of lanterns. He didn't know what he would do with all of it yet, but it made him feel a little better to know he was prepared. Jack returned to Asha's side, sitting beside her as he kept his ears open for any sounds from outside. He couldn't hear the warriors clearly anymore, but he knew they were close. It was only a matter of time before they would make their move. And Jack knew that whatever came next, he would do whatever it took to protect her. Jack could feel the weight of the silence pressing down on him. His back was stiff from hours of waiting, and every creak of the barn's old wood seemed to echo in his ears. He had retreated to the loft, but from his vantage point he could see the movement of the warriors below, pacing outside like wolves circling prey. The stillness was both comforting and unnerving. He knew they were waiting for something, perhaps for him to make a move or for a sign that would give them the reason they needed to act. His eyes flicked over to Asha, still unconscious on the pile of hay. Her pale face looked so fragile, so vulnerable, and it only made the pressure on Jack's chest heavier. She hadn't stirred in hours, and though he knew the fever had broken, she remained deeply unconscious. He hoped that once she woke up, she would be able to help him think more clearly. But for now, he was on his own. Jack's mind raced. The warriors were closing in, and if they found Asha in the barn, he didn't know what they would do. He wasn't sure if they were looking for her specifically, or if they just saw him as another obstacle to be dealt with. Either way, it didn't matter. What mattered was that he couldn't let them get inside. He heard the sound of hooves again, but this time it was different. The warriors weren't circling anymore. They had stopped. Everything was eerily still for a moment. Jack held his breath, straining to hear any sounds of movement, any indication of what they might do next. He cautiously peered over the edge of the loft. There at the front of the barn stood the leader of the warriors. He was a tall, broad man, his dark eyes scanning the barn with sharp, calculating precision. His horse snorted, and the sound seemed too loud in the otherwise silent air. The leader called out to his men in a low voice, and Jack couldn't make out the words. But the tone was clear. There was something serious going on. "Stay low," Jack muttered to himself, his hand tightening around the rifle beside him. He knew he couldn't keep up this game of cat and mouse forever. Sooner or later they would figure out he was inside, and when that happened, things could turn dangerous in an instant. He glanced down at Asha again. She was still lying there, so still and fragile. It broke his heart to see her like this, so far from home and surrounded by danger. She had already been through so much, and now here she was, caught in the middle of a storm she couldn't escape. Jack had to protect her. There was no question about that. A rustling sound below caught Jack's attention. His breath caught in his throat. The warriors were beginning to move again, but this time they weren't just circling. They were preparing for something, gathering in groups, talking in low murmurs. Jack could see the flicker of metal as some of them adjusted their weapons. It didn't take a seasoned fighter to know what that meant. They were gearing up for a confrontation. Jack's hand reached for the rifle at his side, and he checked the ammunition quickly. He wasn't sure how long he could keep the barn secured, but he knew he needed to buy time. Maybe if he made a few shots from the loft, it would confuse them enough to give him a chance to escape with Asha. The thought of running felt dangerous. But what other option did he have? If they overwhelmed him, there would be no escape. As Jack prepared himself, a quiet voice suddenly broke through the silence. It was Asha. Her eyes fluttered open slowly, and she took in the surroundings with a dazed expression. "Jack," she whispered weakly. Are they here?" Jack's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected her to wake up so soon, but he was relieved to see her awake. She needed to know what was going on, but he didn't want to worry her more than necessary. He had hoped she would stay unconscious for a while longer, but now that she was awake, he had to be careful. "They're out there," Jack said, his voice steady but low. "I'm not sure what they want, but we need to stay quiet and wait this out." "Can you stay calm?" Asha nodded weakly, but her brow furrowed. Jack could see the fear in her eyes, and it tore at him. He wished he could promise her that everything would be okay, but he couldn't. The truth was, he didn't know what would happen next. He only knew that he couldn't let them find her. Not now, not ever. The silence stretched on, and Jack could feel every minute weighing on him like a stone. The warriors were still outside, now gathered in a loose circle around the barn. Their voices were faint, but Jack could hear the urgency in their speech. They were talking strategy, and from the way they were moving, he could tell they were preparing to make a move. Jack's mind raced. He had to think of something. He couldn't just sit here and wait for them to break in. But what could he do? The barn was too small to hide in, and if he left the safety of the loft, he'd be vulnerable. There was no clear escape route. He needed to create a diversion, something to make them think he wasn't in the barn anymore. A plan began to form in his mind. A risky plan, but it was the only one he could think of. He could try to lead them away from the barn. If he drew their attention away from Asha, she would have a chance to escape. But how could he be sure they wouldn't catch her before she had the chance to get far enough away? "Asha," Jack whispered, leaning close to her. "Listen to me carefully. When I go out there, I need you to stay hidden. Don't move until I come back for you, all right?" Her eyes were wide, and Jack could see that she was afraid. She didn't want him to leave her. But she nodded, trusting him despite everything. She knew he was her only chance. "Stay down," he said firmly. "I'll be back." Jack turned his attention back to the window. The warriors were still there, but they hadn't started their attack yet. He could see that they were waiting for something, perhaps a signal from their leader, or perhaps they were simply biding their time, unsure of how to approach. Whatever the reason, Jack knew this was his moment. He carefully climbed down from the loft and made his way to the back door of the barn. He had no idea if his plan would work, but he couldn't sit here and wait. He had to act now. Before he opened the door, he glanced at Asha one last time. She was watching him, her face full of worry but also a quiet trust. Jack knew that whatever happened next, he had to protect her. That was all that mattered. Jack's heart raced as he silently eased the barn door open, his eyes scanning the landscape outside. The warriors were still gathered near the barn, their voices rising and falling in quiet discussion. He could sense that they were growing impatient, ready to take action, but they hadn't yet made their move. This was his chance. He glanced back toward Asha. She was lying low, just as he'd asked, her wide eyes watching him with a mixture of fear and trust. Jack gave her a quick, reassuring nod, silently promising that he wouldn't leave her behind. It was a promise he would do everything in his power to keep. Taking a deep breath, Jack crept through the gap in the door and into the open space outside. The air was still, but Jack could feel the tension building like the calm before a storm. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land, and Jack moved quickly, his boots crunching softly against the dirt. He needed to make his way toward the ridge that overlooked the barn. If he could get there, he would have the high ground, giving him an advantage. The warriors hadn't noticed him yet. They were still focused on the barn, unaware that he had slipped away. Jack moved carefully, keeping to the cover of the tall grass that grew in patches around the barn. He could hear the faint murmur of voices behind him, but he didn't dare look back. His focus was entirely on getting to the ridge. As he made his way up the hill, his mind raced with thoughts of what to do next. He wasn't sure how many warriors were out there. He hadn't had time to count them all. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't face them head on. He wasn't a fighter. He was a rancher. But his survival instincts, honed over years of working the land, had never been sharper. He could use the terrain to his advantage, create distractions, and throw the warriors off balance. From the top of the ridge, Jack could see the warriors more clearly. They were still gathered near the barn, a group of them talking in low voices. Some of them were on horseback, while others stood in a loose formation on the ground. There was no sign of their leader, the man who had been giving the orders. Jack figured that the leader was probably nearby, watching everything unfold, waiting for the right moment to strike. Jack's eyes narrowed. He knew that if he waited too long, the warriors would eventually figure out that he was trying to lure them away. He had to act quickly. He took a deep breath, and in one swift movement he fired a shot into the air. The sound of the rifle echoed across the plains, and the warriors immediately stopped what they were doing. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he watched them react. They weren't sure where the shot had come from, but they immediately scattered, looking for cover. It was exactly what he had hoped for. The shot had drawn their attention away from the barn, just as he had planned. Jack quickly reloaded his rifle and fired another shot, this time aimed just to the left of the group. The shot missed its mark but struck the ground with a loud thud, sending up a cloud of dust. This time the warriors were on high alert. They knew someone was out there, but they couldn't tell where the shots were coming from. From his vantage point on the ridge, Jack had a clear view of the warriors. They were disorganized now, moving in different directions, shouting to each other in confusion. It was exactly what Jack needed. He fired again, this time in the opposite direction, causing even more chaos among the warriors. The sound of the rifle was deafening, but Jack didn't stop. Each shot was designed to keep them off balance, to make them question where the real threat was. A few of the warriors mounted their horses and began to ride out toward the noise, their eyes scanning the hills. Jack could see them looking in his direction, but they didn't have a clear line of sight. He took advantage of the confusion, slipping further along the ridge, moving out of their line of sight. He needed to keep them distracted, to buy as much time as he could. Meanwhile, back in the barn, Asha was still lying low, her heart racing. She could hear the faint sounds of gunshots in the distance, and though she didn't fully understand what was happening, she knew that Jack was out there, doing everything he could to protect her. Her chest tightened with worry, but she forced herself to stay calm. She couldn't afford to panic. She had to trust Jack. Inside the barn, she could hear the warriors murmuring again. The noise was quieter now, but she knew that the danger was far from over. The warriors were likely preparing to search the barn, and if they found her, they wouldn't hesitate to take her. She needed to stay hidden, to stay as still as possible. As the minutes ticked by, Jack's plan seemed to be working. The warriors were getting more and more disoriented, spreading out across the field in search of the source of the gunfire. Some of them began to ride out in different directions, clearly frustrated. Jack kept his distance, moving like a shadow, staying hidden behind rocks and trees, always keeping the high ground. But even as Jack's plan seemed to be working, he knew he couldn't keep it up forever. The warriors were too many, and sooner or later they would figure out what was going on. He had to be ready for whatever came next. His fingers tightened around the rifle as he watched the chaos unfold below him. From his perch on the ridge, Jack could see a few of the warriors beginning to regroup, their eyes scanning the area. It wouldn't be long before they realized that they weren't dealing with a simple cowboy. Jack had given them something to think about, but now he had to act fast before they regained their composure. He fired one more shot, this time aimed directly at the ground near the barn. The loud noise echoed across the plains, and several of the warriors immediately turned toward the sound, their horses kicking up dust as they raced in that direction. Jack knew this was his moment. He needed to make his way back to the barn and get Asha to safety, but he couldn't do it alone. He needed to keep the warriors distracted long enough for them to escape. Jack's heart pounded in his chest. He had done what he could, but now the real test was about to begin. He had no idea what the outcome would be, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to give up without a fight. The sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow across the land. The sky above was a beautiful blend of reds and purples, but the peaceful sight only served to remind Jack of the danger that surrounded them. The warriors had been distracted, but they weren't fooled for long. It was clear that they were regrouping, their movements becoming more coordinated as they focused on the barn. The quiet before the storm had passed, and Jack could feel the storm approaching. Jack crouched low on the ridge, his rifle in his hands, eyes scanning the terrain below. He could see the warriors beginning to move toward the barn again, their faces tense, their bodies poised for action. The leader of the group had finally emerged from the shadows, a tall figure whose presence seemed to command respect. Jack could see the leader's sharp gaze sweeping over the area, his men waiting for his signal. It was now or never. Jack's plan had worked, but it had only bought him so much time. He had created confusion, drawn their attention, but the warriors were too skilled to be fooled for long. He knew that the next few minutes would determine everything. If they found Asha, it would be all over. He had to make sure she stayed hidden, and he had to buy enough time for them both to escape. The barn had become a fortress of sorts, but it wouldn't last forever. Jack had taken precautions to make sure the door was secure, and he had used everything at his disposal to create obstacles inside. But in the end, it all came down to this: would his plan succeed, or would they be caught? He turned his head toward the barn, his heart pounding in his chest. The sounds of the warriors were growing louder now, the thundering hooves of their horses kicking up dust as they approached. They were getting closer. Jack's fingers tightened around the rifle. He couldn't let them get inside. Asha was still inside the barn, hidden away. Jack had given her clear instructions to stay quiet and out of sight, and he prayed she would follow them. He knew she was strong, but even she couldn't fight off 100 warriors if it came to that. He had to act quickly. The leader's voice cut through the air, low and commanding. Jack couldn't make out the words, but the meaning was clear. This was their final push. The warriors were closing in, and the time to act was now. Jack took a deep breath, steadied his rifle, and aimed it carefully at a group of trees near the barn. His plan had always been to create enough confusion for them to make their escape. He fired a shot, the loud sound echoing across the open land. It was a warning. He wasn't planning to fight. He was trying to delay them, throw them off track. The warriors reacted immediately, spinning toward the sound of the gunshot. Jack's pulse quickened as he moved quickly, ducking behind a large boulder that jutted out from the ridge. He stayed low, trying to remain unseen as he peered over the top. The warriors were in disarray once again, their attention divided. Some of them began to gallop toward the trees, where they thought the shot had come from. Others stayed near the barn, unsure of what to do next. It was exactly what Jack had hoped for. The chaos he'd caused had worked, but it wouldn't last long. He needed more time, just a little more time. He stood up quickly, moving swiftly along the ridge to a new position. He had to stay one step ahead of them, make sure they didn't realize where he was, and keep them guessing. Every step felt like it took him deeper into the unknown. The stakes were higher than ever, and Jack knew that the window of opportunity was closing fast. In the barn, Asha had heard the shots and the commotion outside. She could feel the air shift, the tension growing thicker with every passing moment. She wanted to help, wanted to do something, but she knew she couldn't. Her body was still weak from the ordeal, and she was in no condition to fight. All she could do was wait and trust Jack. She had to believe that he would keep his promise and get them both out of this alive. She lay still, her hands clenched tightly on the hay beneath her, her thoughts racing. She thought about her people, the tribe she had lost, and the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had been running for so long, always one step ahead of danger. Now it felt like she had reached the end of the road, but Jack had shown her kindness, something she hadn't felt in a long time. He had taken her in when she had nowhere to go, and now, it seemed, he was willing to risk everything to protect her. Her heart swelled with gratitude but also with a deep sadness. She didn't want Jack to get hurt. She didn't want him to sacrifice his life for hers. But in that moment, she knew that he would. Jack was out there, still keeping the warriors at bay. She had to trust him. She had to stay hidden. She closed her eyes, trying to steady her breath and focus on staying calm. Meanwhile, Jack was still on the ridge, his mind racing. He had seen the leader signal to his men, and now they were closing in. The leader had figured out the pattern, and Jack could feel the tension in the air shift. The warriors were no longer guessing. They were moving in for the kill. Jack made his way down the ridge, moving quickly but carefully. His instincts told him to keep his distance, to stay hidden. But the pressure of time was pushing him to act. He needed to get back to the barn, to Asha, before it was too late. He was close now, and the warriors were right behind him. He could hear their voices growing louder, their movements more coordinated. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as he dashed toward the barn. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep this up. When he reached the barn, he paused for just a moment, listening for any signs of movement inside. Everything was quiet. He couldn't waste any more time. He pushed the door open slowly, peeking inside. There was Asha, still hidden in the shadows, waiting for him. "Asha," he whispered urgently, his voice hoarse. "It's time. We have to go." Asha's eyes flickered open, and she nodded, relieved to see him. Jack quickly motioned for her to stay low as they made their way toward the back of the barn. He knew they didn't have much time. The warriors were almost there. Just as they reached the back door, Jack's heart skipped a beat. He heard the unmistakable sound of hooves galloping toward the barn. The warriors had found them. The moment of escape had come, but it was no longer a matter of slipping away unnoticed. Jack grabbed Asha's hand and pulled her toward the door, urging her to move faster. "Stay close," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They dashed into the open field, the sounds of the warriors closing in on them. Jack's mind raced as they sprinted toward the woods. The trees ahead offered some cover, but he knew that the warriors would follow them relentlessly. They had to get further away, fast. As Jack and Asha ran, their hearts pounding in unison, Jack couldn't help but feel a strange sense of hope. It wasn't over yet, but maybe, just maybe, they could make it out of this alive.